In two recent programs, Isaac and I presented the historic rise of homeschooling in America as specifically motivated by the 2020 COVID lockdowns and the resultant awareness by America's parents of the failure of government schools to provide a quality education for their children. Well, we talked then with attorney Scott Woodruff, Senior Counsel for Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and if you did not see those two programs, I would encourage you to go back and watch them as soon as you can, since they do help set the stage for this program today and for what we do next week in part 2. Now, I'm entitling these two programs beginning today, Christian Education, Brick and Mortar Christian Education in America. The program today will focus on the remarkable resurgence, or I'm calling it the revival, perhaps, of Christian education in America. Again, particularly as motivated by the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021. Now, our special guest today will be Ray Moore, retired chaplain in the U.S. Reserves. He is a Citadel graduate and a graduate of Grace Theological Seminary, but he's also the co-founder of Frontline Ministries and currently serving as president of the board of Exodus Mandate. Now, today in part 1, we'll define Christian education. We'll quantify as much as possible how much Christian education has grown in the last years, where it's expanding now, and why it is seeing such growth, and then also try to deal with what parents are actually hoping to achieve for their children by pulling them out of the government school system, something we're seeing happen as we speak. Now, next week in part 2, we'll continue our discussion about Christian education in America and deal with the challenges that are arising, some directly and some very subtly. So regardless of whether you are parents of school-age children or grandparents of school-age children, today's program and next week's program, I think, will be very informative, and I believe will greatly encourage all of you who are watching. So stay tuned as we bring in right now Ray Moore, president of the board of Exodus Mandate. Ray, good to have you back with Isaac and us on today, Stand in the Gap.
Yeah, thank you, Sam and Isaac, and we're really grateful for what you're doing with this program, Stand in the Gap, and the strong message you're putting out all across the land.
Well, Ray, you are one of those individuals. We're glad to have you back because on this subject of Christian education, you have roots. You personally have roots that are both in the area of homeschooling, and I'm going to say Christian homeschooling, as well as the Christian education movement called brick and mortar, where you go and sit in the classroom. So just to get us going on the program today, since you have experience on both of them, pull together just a little bit of history. Homeschooling, beginning, Christian brick and mortar education, how that pulled together, and profile, compare, contrast those two, and perhaps even the parents of those who choose to Christian homeschool as compared to those who decide to Christian brick and mortar Christian educate their children. Big challenge, but you can do it. Go ahead.
My wife Gail and I have a long history with our children and grandchildren involved in both K-12 campus Christian schools and homeschooling. We started homeschooling our oldest son when he was 6 years old, when I was finishing up my theological training at Grace Seminary in Winona Lake, Indiana. And I had moved down to the campus at Purdue University to start a campus ministry there. And all I lacked was my thesis at the seminary. And we were going to enroll our son in a Christian school, but there were financial issues there, and even my wife and I felt they may not have been academically rigorous enough, and so we elected to go what we call the family school or homeschool, and that was in 1977. We may have been among the first several hundred families doing that in the modern era. We didn't know anybody else that was homeschooling in Indiana until about 1981. Not saying we were the first, but we might have been in Indiana. Then when they get about our kids would get about middle school age, we tended to put them in a private campus Christian school. And then toward the end of their careers, my wife then, when they all were enrolled in the private campus Christian school, she taught at that school and ended up her career as head of the English department. So we've had a long history going back to 1977 with homeschooling and then later campus Christian schools. In 1997, I felt led to offer the Exodus Mandate, that's exodusmandate.org, as a project or a ministry to help get churches and families to get their kids out of the government schools entirely and opt only for campus Christian schools or homeschooling. So we support both pretty equally. We find that both are good, and we think really homeschooling might be a superior model, particularly in the early years up to puberty. If we were starting fresh now, we might take them all the way through the 12th grade in homeschooling. We see so many people that do such a good job even through high school.
All right, Ray, that's a great setup. And ladies and gentlemen, that sets the stage for, again, connecting what we talked about, rise of homeschooling, the last two programs, and then now brick and mortar, or what Ray Moore, our guest today, is calling campus setting type schooling. When we come back, we're going to continue discussion with him and talk about what has happened now in the last years where and why Christian education, brick and mortar, even homeschooling as far as that goes, has seen such a significant growth. We'll be right back.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Well, Ray, for me as a father, education is extremely important, but even more important than education is a Christian worldview. And so I grew up in a Christian school. My wife was homeschooled. We are kind of a hybrid with our children where we're schooling them at home, but we're using BJU Press and the videos out of BJU Press at this time. I've taught in public schools for a number of years. I've been involved with churches that do child evangelism fellowship, where they do release time during the day at the public school, Bible clubs afterwards. So to me, I know that education is extremely important. I also know that for parents, there's no easy way out of educating your children. There's not one option that's easy and the others are hard. And as a Christian, there's no way to know for sure that our kids will follow after the Lord. We do our best to train them, to disciple them. But it's extremely important, and that biblical worldview, the Christian viewpoint, is of the utmost importance. So I've studied a lot about education in America, and I've tried to study a lot about the homeschool movement. But we're just so glad to have you back on this program so we can pick your brain, because you have done so much research in this. So could you kind of talk to us, maybe an overview about the education movement in America? The last 100 years has just been an incredibly diverse journey, but how Christian education got started and how it kind of came to fruition to the points of the 2020s with the lockdowns and all that we saw then.
Well, first we want to go back even prior to that, because it's important for Christians to know that for the first 220 years of American history, we had no state-sponsored public schools as we know them today. Almost all education was provided by family groups, by churches, and in New England, they had kind of a community system, which was sort of a hybrid. There were really Christian schools, but there were community schools as well. And that system existed till Horace Mann in the 1840s, and that's when the big change took place in America, starting in the 1840s. And the Unitarians got involved, and it was because of heavy Catholic immigration into New England and New York and Pennsylvania, and it scared the Protestant clergy. We were almost entirely a Protestant nation at that time, and they began to think, well, we can use. Horace Mann said, look, let's use the state. We'll have public tax subsidized schools, and we will coerce Catholic children using the government schools into Protestantism. That really was the plan. Now, I'm not a Catholic. I'm an evangelical, but it's still wrong to any group to coerce another group's children. And it was a mistake, and it was a terrible mistake. But that was the plan that the Unitarians had, and they tricked the Protestants into going into state education, and they gradually gave up their Christian schools, just very gradually. It took decades for that to happen, but by the turn of the 20th century, the public school system as we know it today was pretty dominant in America. Now, in the modern era, we could trace the rise of Christian schools, Christian day schools, or brick and mortar schools, as we're talking about them today, probably in the 60s and 60s and 70s in the modern era. Unfortunately, some of that had a unhealthy connotation as well, particularly in the South, because a lot of them were motivated by the desegregation that was going on in the public schools. And but even today, those schools, which were segregated private schools in the 60s and 70s, have fully integrated now and are actively recruiting minorities and Black students into Christian education. So that's where we are today. And that went on up until the modern times. And I would say private Christian schools, campus schools, may have a population of about 1.5 million. And that would include ACSI, which is the largest society or accrediting association for Christian schools. Then you have Classical Christian Schools, Association of Classical Christian Schools, AACS, and they have about 250 to 300,000 children. And then you have smaller groups like Christian School Association. A lot of those are in upper Midwest among the Dutch people. So the movement has grown gradually, but it's taking a new life today, just like homeschooling is exploding. And I think you've already had a program on this, and I'm going to try to confine my comments to campus Christian schools or brick and mortar schools. But also, private Christian schools are growing rapidly as well.
Okay, Ray, let me just jump in on you right here. You know, even this morning when we're doing this program, you talked about the number of students. Even this morning, I heard on radio they're using a number of 10 million students who in the last couple of years, post-COVID lockdowns, they're saying this morning, have permanently left the government schools and gone into Christian education. Now, they did not say that this morning, homeschools. That's a number I can't corroborate, but that is a big number, and their point was a lot of movement. You can comment on that, but then also add it to this, because just as in homeschooling, there are different methodologies that parents can use and different approaches. Same thing that's happening also in Christian schools today, is it not? I want you to just talk about how some of that is happening. But one thing I can say is that, to my knowledge, as I am working with individual Christian schools across the country, here in Pennsylvania, most schools, most like churches who have schools, there are waiting lists. There seems to be a full enrollment, which is indication that there's been quite a bit of growth. Talk a little bit about that growth part that we've seen in the last 2 years and the types of options that are there for parents who are considering brick and mortar Christian schools.
10 million seems pretty high to me. I wish it were true, and I pray it will be true, but it seems a little excessive. From 2020 to 2021, there were 2 million children that dropped out of the public school system. And the whole field is so fluid, it's really hard to know the details of what's happening. But back to your point, we do know that typically, and we've done samplings, I don't have the money to do a massive study on this, but we think campus Christian schools or brick and mortar Christian schools are growing at a rate of 10, 20, 30, and sometimes 40% a year in the last couple of years, maybe last several years. My children and now my grandchildren attend a large ACSI Christian school in Columbia, South Carolina, and they were about 850 to 900 students 3 years ago before the pandemic, and they've grown to from say 900 to 1150 in 2 or 3 years. And I haven't done the math on the percentage of that, but they have a waiting list, and they're growing and they're very typical. And there's another new Christian school in my community that's 10 years old, and they're exploding, and they're up over 700, and just a couple of hundred when they started, and they're having to build, and that's just in this community where I live. So we know that this is happening around the country, and I'm in contact right now with about a half a dozen churches in this region, the southern region, that want to start Christian schools. So maybe we can talk a little bit about 2 groups that we work with that are doing that. But I would guess there could be several hundred situations nationally where churches are contemplating and planning to start Christian schools.
Okay, Ray, let me follow with a question, and I think Isaac will have something as well. But let me just go here with you, and that is this. The motivation of parents back in the 60s and 70s when Christian education began. Can you recall what the primary motivations were for parents who put their children in Christian education and pursued that, as compared to what appears to be the primary driving motivation for this period of growth that we're talking about right now, post-COVID?
I think the primary motivation today is the breakdown and the lack of any discipline and law and order in the public school system. Yesterday on Fox News, and I'll just make reference this real quick, it was a Nation's report card, and they showed that only 20% of students in the Los Angeles and Chicago school systems, only 20% were reading at grade level. Not 20%, 20% only. It means 80% are not even up to grade level. And in Baltimore, it was 7%, and in Detroit, it was 3%. I mean, the system is utterly failing. It's not even academically succeeding. And the federal government, since COVID, has invested $190 billion in the public school system nationally to help catch up since the pandemic. Now, most education dollars don't come from the federal government, they come from the state governments. So 190 billion infused into the public school system nationally, that's a lot of money, because most of the money is coming from our states. And the system is just failing massively, and conservative and Christian people are becoming aware of it. But they also found out that 92% of parents in America believe that their students are operating at grade level because they're getting very good grades. There's a lot of grade inflation that goes on. You can go into some of these schools and be doing F or D or C level work and make straight A's. So they're just lying to the parents. So they bring a report card home and, man, my kid is making all A's, but he can't read and write. So the system is failing. And then I think another issue, and maybe more important in my mind, is that Christians and finally pastors are coming to terms with the fact that there is a biblical teaching on K-12 and also higher education. The scriptures and sound theology assign the education of children to the family and church, not the government. The state of Pennsylvania has no business educating children at the K-12 level. It's not their job, and they've usurped it. So we need to hand it back to the families, get the kids out, and do it ourselves.
Okay, Ray, I think that's excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come back and ask for Ray to do a little bit of a challenge here, but certainly lower academic standards, obvious. Ray's talked about that. Immoral curriculum, teachings of what kids are learning. Parents saw that the last few years. That is a problem. And then Ray's just suggesting right now that perhaps Christian parents are becoming more aware that really, truly, when God says education of their children is their responsibility, maybe some of them are taking it seriously. We'll be right back.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Well, welcome back to the program. And as we talk about Christian education in America, I just want to ask you, Ray, what would you say to parents or grandparents or family members that are involved helping make the decision for the education of young people in that family? There's kind of this, I think, a better understanding, especially among Christians, that no matter where your kids are at school, you as the parents need to be involved. It's your responsibility, and maybe you're doing some at home or at a Christian school or a private school or a public school, but there are those who would say, I feel that it's best for my kids to be in a public government school because they can be salt and light in that environment. It gives them witnessing opportunities, and they're trying to take advantage of those opportunities. There may be others who say, I'm so concerned about them having a fear of the Lord and not walking in the way of ungodly counsel that I don't want them there. What would you say to parents who are trying to consider which one is best for them? That you have this whole ministry of getting families to take kids out of the public school. What is the point that you're trying to make with that?
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't recommend in any case that parents would put their kids in public school to be salt and light. That is a terrible argument. They use a scriptural text to abuse and make a teaching that Jesus never gave. And so it hangs on to the church like a case of body odor. You just can't seem to get rid of it. Oh, my kids are being salt and light. They're being missionaries. And they're not. I mean, there's always exceptions. So we really take a position that the scriptures, don't allow you to put your children in harm's way in a pagan school. And it's pretty hard. And sometimes people don't like me for that, but I would say that I've been willing to draw a line in the sand there is probably one of the reasons the Lord has allowed us to stay in this ministry and blessed us as we have, because we really we don't back down on that. Now, the other thing I would say is that you don't get a do-over with your children. You've got to invest in them when they're young and provide Christian education, either homeschooling or Christian schooling. And it's probably more important than higher ed. A lot of grandparents invest in their children when they go to college. And they say, well, when they go to college, we want to be sure they go to a good college, maybe a Christian college. But they allow them to stay in a public school when they're in K-12. So by the time they get to be college age, they're spoiled. So I would say grandparents who are Christians who want to help their children should invest in their grandchildren when they're in K-12.
Okay, and Ray, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to watch us next week as well. We go into part 2. Ray's laid down the challenge, and we echo it. Parents, grandparents, your children and grandchildren must be instructed in the ways of the Lord, or the world will get them. and the world is after our children. Now, the significant growth of homeschooling and Christian education, brick and mortar we're talking about, is now attracting challenges. There are those who don't like this. Next week in part 2, we're going to identify those challenges coming to Christian education. And again, take this information, consider it where you are, pray for God's wisdom and the courage to make right decisions.